we are taught to believe that backup plans are prudent and that optionality is good. And I always felt like that's not really true. Think about all the times when you've done something so excruciatingly difficult that required every bit of your energy, emotional and otherwise, to pull it off. You didn't need 95% and you didn't need 100, you need 110%. Just thinking about plan B, there's energy leakage that's enough to undermine it.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Matt Higgins knows that sometimes the best way to move ahead is to make sure there's no way back. Military strategists from Julius Caesar to Sun Tzu have seen the wisdom of motivating their troops by making retreat impossible. Matt has applied this principle to his career and his many businesses. His first lesson in it came young. As a struggling teen, Matt was working at McDonald's for $3.75 an hour just to put food on the table for his ailing mother. But when he saw that college grads were getting paid a lot more, he decided to do something that every adult told him was a very bad idea. He dropped out of high school, got his GED in record time, and immediately enrolled in college. He earned his degree before some of his peers got out of high school. By the time he was 26, he was the press secretary for the New York mayor's office. As Work for Humans approaches our 100th episode, and yes, I am proud, I'll be bringing back some popular episodes that I think new listeners would like to hear, and longtime listeners will enjoy hearing again. This episode with Matt Higgins drew an incredibly strong response from a very broad range of listeners. Matt Higgins is co-founder and CEO of RSE Ventures, a private firm that incubates and invests in enterprises like the International Champions Cup, RESY, and the Drone Racing League, among others. He appeared as a guest shark on seasons 9 and 10 of Shark Tank. He's the recipient of the Ellis Medal of Honor and is a current executive fellow at the Harvard Business School. He just released his first book, Burn the Boats, in which he lays out why sometimes it's necessary to toss Plan B overboard. Matt and I talk about how backup plans can subvert our true purpose, emotional intelligence and intuition and decision-making, using our own anxiety to achieve objectives, and being realistic about opportunity costs. We also discuss how to extract value from negative situations, acting early and taking risks for greater results, how Elon Musk has handled Twitter, and other topics. If you're a fan of Work for Humans, please show your support by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And now I bring you Matt Higgins. Welcome, Matt Higgins, to Work for Humans.
Thanks for having me.
When I first saw the title of your book, my first thought was, and just to tell everybody, the title of the book is Burn the Boats. And my very first thought was, don't burn the boats. But I will tell you, as I read it, it didn't just change my mind, but I realized I always believed in burning the boats. And so it's just a question of how. So let's start from the beginning. And how did you arrive at writing this book?
Wow, so much to unpack right there. And I, throughout my life, this phrase has been resurfacing at different key moments. And the most recently was when I worked for the New York Jets. And the head coach was making an improbable playoff run and was in a losing streak, Rex Ryan. And for those who follow football or are listening, Rex is a big guy, big jowls, very animated, very emotive, and a player's coach, as they say. And he gave this speech to the entire team of young men about Cortez in 1519 and told the story of Burn the Boats, when Cortez supposedly burned all his boats and took on the Aztecs. Very bad man, by the way, not to be emulated. But that's the famous Burn the Boat story. And the New York Times did an article about his Churchillian speaking skills and how when they interviewed a lot of different players, the players attributed their improbable success to the Burn the Boat speech. Throughout my career, as I've done all these things, somewhat improbable, I began to examine my life, realized, at the center of it all was putting myself in situations in which I had no retreat. And that I often say problems beget solutions. And I think we have an inverse relationship with risk. We raise the bar to our action when we should be lowering our bar. And I wanted to write a book on why we hesitate. And I thought, if I could take this phrase that goes back to the beginning of recorded history, we can get into it way before Cortez, but I could pull it forward and turn this jingoistic idea of no retreat and turn the boats into a metaphor for all the things in our lives that hold us back. I could speak to the risk adverse, the anxiety laden like myself, who often select out of ambition, self-select out because they feel like it's not for them. And collectively, we could own this idea of burn the boats. But I knew that people like you and myself, when they saw that, would have a anxiety response.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And a lot of your stories that you tell sort of go like this. So-and-so burnt the boats and they made $1 billion. But the truth is, it applies to a lot more than money. It applies to a lot more than business. It's all over our lives.
Yeah, the simple premise is that we are taught to believe that backup plans are prudent and that optionality is good. And oftentimes it comes from our parents, but it's also the invisible hand of government and everything around us. And I always felt like that's not really true. For me, I happened upon this idea when I was growing up in abject poverty in Queens, New York, taking care of a single mom, and was very desperate. And I used to sell flowers on street corners and scrape gum under McDonald's tables. I talk about it in the book. And I was honestly very depressed, at times self-destructive, and frustrated that there was no cavalry coming. When you're a little boy and you're being raised by a single mom, all you want is for a man to come along, or you want society to come along. And in my teen years, they were full with disillusionment, false hope. And finally, I had an epiphany, the most important one of my life, which came from my mother, which was that she got a GED as an adult and was able to go to college with a GED. And I was frustrated making like $3.75 McDonald's, and I would see these ads in a local newspaper saying college students only, and they'd make like $8. And I would think, well, what is it about a college student that makes you pay 2x? But I got to be a college student. And I had this epiphany that I was going to drop out of high school at 16, and I was going to get a GED, and I was going to start 2 years before my graduating class. Now, I thought this was brilliant. When I told my teachers and my guidance counselors, they all said, you're out of your mind and you're going to be branded a loser. And this is my burn the boats moment. I don't know where this defiance came from as a child. And maybe it was a gift from my mother, but I knew that I have to get the system to stop intervening on what I know is right for me. They don't have full context to the fact that my mother is literally dying in the room next door to me and she can't even bathe herself. And I am so frustrated that I'm feeling self-destructive, that I need to take matters into my own hands. This plan is right for me, but everybody kept intervening. And so I knew I needed to self-sabotage. I actually needed to burn the boat so I'd have no other option. And I failed every single class except typing. And I got left back over and over and over again. And I executed. And a year later, I went to my prom as president of the debate team at my college. And I had, in one chess move, flipped the script. I now had pulled for my entire career. And the book goes into how that one single decision compounded all my professional success. But in hindsight, I realized I've been burning my boats my entire life. But I thought, why is it that we reject that wisdom? Why is it that we're taught the complete opposite? Can I construct the argument that our relationship with risk is wrong and that backup plans are actually the things that are subverting our true purpose?
Yeah, I thought it was very persuasive. It doesn't mean invest everything in crypto. That's not what it means. But it does mean that if you want to be great, you can't do it by half measures.
Yeah, let's get into that a minute. So I thought, well, maybe this jingoistic approach only applies to dictators and genocidal generals from the beginning of time. A couple of things that was interesting. One, burn the boats is actually the OG life hack that goes all the way back to the Old Testament. In fact, Sun Tzu in The Art of War talks about it. The Chinese have a word for it from a battle in 206 BC. So it has military historical authority. But that does it hold up with science? There's a seminal study, I believe the only time this was actually studied, out of Wharton in 2014, where they wanted to test what is the impact of one merely thinking about a backup plan when they're pursuing their plan A. And they gave students two groups. One group said, instead of, getting your Snickers bar via this thing, think about other ways you might be able to get it. And what they found, two interesting findings. One, the group that was allowed to think about another way to get the prize performed materially less. And two, was less intrinsically motivated. They didn't care anymore. And then they found all sorts of ways to try to undermine the research. Well, maybe it's because their mind was working too hard. No, they were allowed to think about vacations. They performed the same. So what they found in the conclusion, which is somewhat radical, is that just thinking about plan B can undermine plan A. So why is that? And I think if anyone breaks it down, they'll completely understand what I'm about to say. Think about all the times when you've done something so excruciatingly difficult that required every bit of your energy, emotional and otherwise, to pull it off. You didn't need 95% and you didn't need 100. You need 110%. Just thinking about plan B, there's energy leakage that's enough to undermine it. But of course, that defies a degree of common sense because we think that's not prudent. What I argue in my book is the reason why we conjure plan B in the first place is we haven't embraced our inner catastrophizer like I do. And by embracing it at the beginning of a bold journey, you ask yourself 4 fundamental questions. 1, what's the worst that's going to happen? 2, what would I do if the worst thing were to happen? We all have within ourselves the ability to save ourselves, to mitigate risk, but we underestimate it because we don't ask. 3, what's the statistical likelihood or probability that the worst thing's going to happen? It's pretty remote. We usually imagine reputational damage that usually isn't going to happen. And 4, most importantly, what would I not be willing to endure to achieve my plan A? That why is so eclipsing of all your anxiety and doubt that it will power you. And I say this to parents all the time who reject the premise of the book. I love this debate. Matt, I have a 10-year-old and they dream of being on a soccer team and they need a backup plan. And I said, let me ask you a question. Think about all the things you really want to do in life. How hard would it have been at any moment to choose a soul-crushing job? Soul-crushing jobs are everywhere. Your kid will find a soul-crushing job, have no fear. But they'll never be the next Ronaldo or Taylor Swift if you don't telegraph to them that it's possible.
What is being burnt?
Yeah, I think, well, let's talk about what's in the use of the boat metaphorically. In my experience in dealing, now look, some of this is qualitative, some of it's quantitative, right? So on the qualitative side, I've interacted with hundreds of CEOs and founders, either as an investor and owner of the company or as a partner. And the recurring fact patterns I see are, number 1, legacy issues. The metaphorical boats are shame. For me, I was so embarrassed that I grew up in abject poverty dirt and that I didn't have the refinement that it was holding me back. 2, I thought I still was fighting a battle to save my mother, who died the day I became press secretary when I was 26. That was an unreconciled battle and trauma that made me act frenetically. I was constantly motivated by adrenaline and fear of ending back in that dirty apartment about to be evicted. So I had not burned the metaphorical boat of fear of trauma. So the boats that we tend to have are either shame, our unreconciled trauma, our anxiety, our fear of failure, or our fear of recurring past failure. So a lot of these are psychological issues, to be honest. I find boats are mostly psychological. And it's why you need to create safe space with your managers or your leaders or your partners to allow them to be vulnerable so they could probe those metaphorical boats. And then on the things that hold us back are usually reputational, and we're amplifying. They are underestimating our ability to feed ourselves. Frankly, we tend to project onto other people. They're the reason why we don't burn the boats. Well, I would, if I didn't have kids and had to go to Little League practice, I would have done it. But I decided to sacrifice my entire life's goal for my children. I'm like, do you think your children really want to carry that burden? So we tend to make excuses and project it onto other people. At least those are the patterns that I tend to see.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Sun Tzu had a great phrase in the translation that I read that I've never been able to find before. He said, put your people on death ground. And he said, back to a river or back to a cliff so that they know they have to fight, which is essentially, it's a change management tool, which is that I have a force that some of them want to fight and some of them don't. I can make all of them want to fight. That's great. And a part of what you're saying is I need to put myself on death ground. The rest of Sun Tzu's book is about how to sharpen your swords. It's about how many chariots you need to get all your people to the front. It's about all these things around it that make it possible. So what are those things for you?
Definitions matter. Nuance matters when you're talking about burn the boats, because it could fall apart if we don't define it correctly, right? And I think the way that it falls apart when people hit me with objections is they bring up a tactic and they say, well, isn't a definition of insanity to repeat doing the same thing over and over again, right? That isn't working. And I always say, you have to burn the boats for goals, not for tactics. So what works for me is to make sure that I have defined the objective broad enough so that it gives me room to iterate freely. Because I find when I meet a CEO who's help resistant or is doomed, they tend to under-index for self-awareness, but also they have gone all in, burned the boats on a tactic. And they have failed to zoom out and say, that's not really what I want. The how is not what I want. It's the why and the what, right? And so for me, what works for me is making sure that I have defined it broadly enough so that I can accommodate failure of a particular tactic and continue to press ahead on the goal. I tend to catastrophize. Like, that's why I wrote this book. I'm the last person who should write this book, but I'm the first person who should write this book, right? You would believe that this is written by some self-possessed crypto bro, who says like, to hell with everybody. I'm the opposite. What works for me is to truly meditate on the downsides what bad could go wrong so that I can go ahead and when plan B creeps up, I can put it down. I'll make that less abstract. In the book, I talk about my divorce. It's the last thing I want to talk about. But I felt like it was a wasted opportunity if I didn't put it in there, one, to model failure, but two, to speak to somebody who's alone in a hotel room watching their life fall apart and know that I see you. I really didn't want to do it. So I got a phone call once from right before it's going to print from a magazine saying, we love the book. We want to excerpt it. Here's the part we want to use about your divorce. I'm like, that part? And I didn't follow my own advice. It creeped into my head. And even though the book had already gone to the publisher and was about to be in the world, I said no. And I was going for a walk one morning and thinking, this is the exact opposite advice I give. And I share this to say I'm not a robot, right? Like this advice is hard, but it happens to be true. I went through this, said, wait a second, you already processed this when you wrote it. What's the worst that's going to happen? It's one page in the middle of the book, but it could potentially help somebody. And it's my why. And I didn't follow my own advice. And I realized how inefficient that I spent the energy, mental energy, revisiting this fact pattern again and again. And I offer that up as an illustration. We behave so irrationally sometimes. The die is already cast. The book is out there. Why am I spending any mental energy? And the mental energy I devoted to worrying about that excerpt made me less effective for that day in pushing the book out, right? Like I lost the opportunity to maybe reach another guy. It's the very reason I wrote that page. So what works for me is that risk process where I really think through what I said, those 4 questions.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of an intellectual approach to business versus your gut. And one of the things I really got from the book is that business is not a math puzzle. It's a people puzzle. And one of the puzzle pieces is yourself. And so you talk a lot about decision-making with your gut. What does that mean?
Yeah, I love that we're talking about this. I think that EQ gut doesn't scale well, and it's very hard to instruct a bunch of MBAs from Harvard or Wharton at a private equity shop. You got to really look for gut. When you're doing your diligence, make sure you've assessed self-awareness. And as a result, we miss the most important parts because it's not scalable. Maybe people who tend to go into finance don't always over-index for EQ. And so I think these massive firms, there is an FTX, is because they weren't overly relying on gut. The guy's not making eye contact with you and doesn't want any scrutiny or a board of directors. What does that tell you, right? Like weirdly, in my investing experience in building companies, so little of that is taught, is expressed. The Italians have a great phrase where it says, the fish rots from the head. And nothing could be truer in business, but we don't talk a lot about it. In the book, I try to illustrate how much nonsense there is around this idea that the best decisions are data-driven by thinking about some of the greatest inventions of our time. If you look at Steve Jobs, when he went into his pocket and he pulled out, an iPod, he basically wanted to carry around his Beatles collection in his pocket. He could have iterated on the Walkman. For those youngins listening, that was like a random device that would carry your music. You only got 16 songs. So he started with the problem, but he had no data to believe that everyone else wanted to also carry around thousands of songs in their pocket. So it began with an intuition. It'd be great if there was a better way to carry our music. Did some research. Well, Walkmans are ubiquitous. People like music. The green light was intuition. I believe people want this product. And what I make the point in my book is that opportunity arrives before the tipping point of evidence. And in fact, the magnitude of an opportunity has an inverse relationship with the evidence there is to support it. So to unpack that, right? If I'm really, really early, I think AI is going to be huge and NVIDIA is going to be a massive company because we all need GPU chips. The earlier I acted on that, the more money I made with the less evidence. We are taught to believe the opposite, going back to the premise of the book, Burn the Boats, right? We are taught evidence is prudent. More data is better. Backup plan is bad. Whereas all that's doing is denying you the benefit of exponential outcomes.
There's another military thinker, John Boyd. One of the things he cares about a lot is the tempo of decision making. And it seems to me that the very analytical evidence-based approach is also slow. That if you can trust your gut, you can be a lot faster. Does that play into your thinking?
100%, number one. And two, the older you get, the word gut is a proxy for pattern recognition, which is the neural networks that have been created subconsciously that you can't even access deliberately. But if you add them all up, they speak to one big collective insight from everything you've been through, right? That's pattern. So gut, honestly, is a simple way of saying pattern recognition. Intuition is the same. What I'm really saying is allow those neural networks to work for you, your cumulative wisdom, that what you see is not like a sixth sense. It's not really even gut or intuition. It is data driven. It's just you can't put your finger on it because it's the cumulative feedback loop of everything you've been through. That's what I'm saying. If you don't discount that, like that, again, unless you're just delusional or you had a few drinks, like that's trying to tell you something. And so I believe, and I've seen this over and over and over again, the CEOs who fail and companies who fail, it's because they didn't listen to the collective intuition, pattern recognition that told them you don't have product market fit or you're about to be eaten alive by this competitor. They waited for data or they allowed a pride to get in the way. Whereas if they had just acted on pattern recognition / gut, they would have been able to iterate. So I'm 100% convinced of it. I know I'm right. I know, back to your point, data-driven decision making is very slow. And at the scale, going back to my other point, by the time you waited for the data to bubble up, it probably is too late to change course.
That fits with so many things from my own experience. I was a boxer.
That's very cool, by the way. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Were you good?
Was I good? Undefeated.
All right. That's a good measure of good.
But what happens is, being very intellectual myself, you have to train your brain stem to box because your intellect is too slow. And so all of boxing is about training something that is actually inaccessible to your intellect. And another example is, I grew up spearfishing. Well, a halibut under the sand is invisible, but you look at enough sand and eventually you can see that sand is not right. Your brain has to be kind of quiet for it to come through to you.
By the way, that is an amazing example. Anyone listening to that now is visualizing a couple of the grains being different, a little bit of the slope probably around maybe a little bit of an air bubble that is almost imperceptible. Like, that's incredible. That's it right there.
What's funny is there's no specific thing that doesn't match. It's just something says, that's not right. It's almost unconscious. So let's talk a little bit about your experience teaching at Harvard Business School. I kind of want to know how you fit into that curriculum. And to some extent, I'm testing business school curriculums when I ask that question. And to some extent, I'm testing who are the students who are in the Harvard Business School and what have they come to believe when they meet you. And so how has that experience been?
I mean, amazing. Back to me putting myself in these uncomfortable positions. I'd never taught before, but always had this. One is ego driven and one is purpose driven. The ego driven was, could I have competed at the best? I felt like I never had a chance to go to a top school. I went to my city college while I was taking Queens College to take care of my mom. I went to Fordham Law. I was on law review, but I always felt like there's an academic side of my personality that I could get lost, right? I read studies all the time. And then the other was love teaching and mentoring. And so I approached it in working with an incredible professor at Harvard, Len Schlesinger, has been there decades, giant. Basically, what does Harvard under index for that I could help solve? That's always how I work backwards. What does the client need, basically? And in the case of Harvard, as you might imagine, there are a lot of brilliant minds, but there are not as many practitioners interwoven in the environment. And as a result, the case studies tend not to be contemporary, and they don't always reflect the students in that room. And they certainly don't reflect what they're consuming on Instagram. That's number one. Two, you generally think of Stanford as more of a place for entrepreneurs, Wharton as a place for finance, right? So if I could bring some of the more practical exposure, contemporary of the moment to the school, my co-professor, Len, would joke, only somebody so naive who had never been to business school would have proposed the course that we put together. So and the last thing is I said, well, I look at everything as ROI. And if I was spending, $250,000 at business school, I want to deliver them a 5x return on their education in a week. Like, is that possible? What would it take? And that's how I approached it, right? Serve something for the client that they don't have, give students an unmemorable experience that would change their life, and give them a big ROI. And so I put together this course with Len over the course of a year to design it, where we would bring the latest cutting edge companies to HBS in the direct-to-consumer space. And we would constantly evolve it, all built on the premise that DTC is actually a fiction. It's a launch vertical to go e-com. Every business ends up omni-channel. So let's constantly reassess what does it mean to go from DTC to an omni-channel business. And I killed myself the first year, brought incredible speakers, chain smokers in from California, and the Gronkowski brothers, all of them to work the students out as a metaphor for what it takes to build a company. And I go through this whole thing, and it was so uncomfortable. I talk in the book about having imposter syndrome and the anxiety of the experience. I do tend to redefine every context to make it work for me. So my wife is in the room with me. My wife is generally in every room with me. She's my partner and everything, and she handled the logistics. She's the only one who could tolerate my insanity. And at the end of it, it was so great. The students stood up and gave me a standing ovation. And Len turns to me and goes, this is not normal. Because I don't know. And then one student handed me a note. It's one of my most treasured possessions. It's behind me on my desk. I keep it everywhere with me, saying that this kid was a genius, getting multiple degrees at the same time. He goes, I had decided that this school really wasn't right for me because I have a more entrepreneurial bent and I wasn't going to continue. But this one class gave me such a return on my investment. I'm going to finish. And I just love everything collided at one point at the end of that class. Like, this is what happens when you put yourself in uncomfortable positions. It's what happens when you solve a problem for somebody else. And look what I've done for these students for one week of effort. So I hope that answers your question. It was just it's incredible. And now we're in year 5, and it's the most popular intensive program. Now, other things are also at work, which I also talk about in the book. When you use anxiety to propel you to do great things, I talk in the book about how you have to toggle between these different states of anxiety, enough to catalyze excellence, not too much to inhibit your performance. Once I do a hard thing, that the hard thing becomes the second time. Now what's my motivation system? I'm not anxious anymore. Now I got to resist complacency, because one of the premises of the book is that the joy of living is in the striving. We all want perpetual growth, but you don't want to look back and have a bunch of half-finished projects either. So I'm always trying to force myself to stay with things.
So there are these phases. You've kind of touched on them, and I want to talk about how each of them feel. There's the phase when you see an opportunity, and the challenge there is that that's probably not the only opportunity you're seeing at that moment, and you have to decide which of those opportunities to go after. And then there's the part where you've decided to go all in, and you get yourself on death ground, and it's scary. And then there's the part where it succeeds or it fails. What's the fun parts of each of those? Because for sure, there's scary parts that you need to make it work for you. In other words, to motivate you.
Well, let's talk about those different phases, right? There's the moment, there's the epiphany, all right, when you feel like you're onto something. That's exciting and euphoric. So you need to lean into it, while then you need to pressure test it. So a lot of my effort are to talk myself out of things, not talk myself into them. I have been through enough of my own bad decision making by witnessing others that where people often go wrong is when they have an epiphany in the middle of the night. They're so excited because they want to leave behind that which they're running from. They also are worried there'll never be another one. I think people prematurely commit to their spontaneous epiphanies. One, because they're running from something, not running to it. They just don't realize it. But two, they're afraid this is the only one they're going to have, right? And I always say, it's like ideas are like houses. There's always a better one coming on the market next week. You have to trust that. So my process is euphoria, but now pressure testing, auditing. And now I got to make sure I consult the right people. I say you want to consult agendaless supporters, pragmatic optimists, because if you consult a pessimist, they're going to kill it, right? And then things die. So, but a lot of my initial phase is now pressure testing. And then the next phase is, okay, even if my epiphany is correct, is it interesting enough to sustain me 3 years from now when I don't look like the version of Matt that I am today? So I have to then forecast the opportunity cost, not of this moment, but future opportunity costs based upon the growth trajectory of this idea. I think people, they just don't respect themselves enough to do this. You have to believe that you're an iterative creature on a growth trajectory. And 3 years down the road, you're like, all right, this idea was great at the moment in time, but now it doesn't make sense. If it passed that test, like, okay, it passes the opportunity test, then it's about clearing the deck. How do I go all in on this? How do I put myself in a position to attack this and to give it everything I need, while at the same time not compromising my self-respect because I abandon other projects or other people? This last part is the hardest part that I struggle with, because inevitably, when you work with people on a project or you work intensely and you build something together, when you move on, it creates frustration. Also, when you morph to another version of yourself, it's threatening to other people. They want to pull you back in. So they make phrases like, you're doing that now? I mean, or I didn't realize you knew anything about that subject. The slight undercutting comments people make. I think the third phase is the hard phase. It's the burn the boats moment where I'm going to go all in. And I have to really, that's why so much of my book and so much about my philosophy is preparation for the act of burning the boats, because most people know how to burn the boat, right? They know how to go all in. They don't know how to stay the course. A lot of it is the third part. But where I struggle with the most probably is the disappointment I might leave in my wake from moving on, if I'm being honest. And where I struggle with my own sense of self-respect is, am I doing right by the projects I started?
What are the funnest bits?
So the funnest bit. Okay, good. I forgot about that. See, this is how much my life's so little about the joy that I forgot about the essence of the question. The act of being early and right makes me feel closer to God, the universe, because it feels like it was discerned from those neural networks, from my collective experience. I feel like I'm sitting in the stream in a Buddhist way, right? Like, you can't step in the same river twice. It feels like I'm accessing the codes of the universe. And the act of being early and right based on limited information is awe-inspiring. That's the fun part. I have these moments where I'm like, holy shit. Like, I saw that from so far out and I was right. Now, I would urge anyone listening to this, if you have no money, no power, no confidence, but you have an insight, just write it down. If you see the next Taylor Swift, and except in hip hop or whatever, because you're listening to Spotify and write it down and write down what you would have done with that insight if you had money, power, agency, or confidence. You get to take credit for that, even though you couldn't act on it, right? That trains your muscle memory in the smallest ways and in the biggest ways. The act of being early in the right is the greatest joy, other than my children, that I have in my life. On a big way, it's the act of dropping out of high school, having the courage to do that, to go from McDonald's at 375 to the youngest press secretary in history by 26. Honestly, my mother dying, and weirdly, was confirmatory that I needed to act urgently and to be like, trust that the threat is real. To small ways. Last week, I'll reconstruct it really quick for anybody listening. I've become obsessed with AI. I've been in the weeds with AI, playing with different tools on Twitter, learning about the latest tools. It became very clear to me after 2 months of research that this is the greatest technological transformation of my lifetime, and that I started looking for who are the beneficiaries of it, who does the plumbing, who's the infrastructure. And out of everything, I settled on NVIDIA. And what I was excited about is, other than Microsoft, I couldn't find another winner. And I thought, you know what? That's a lot of concentration of cash, deal flow, and purchasing power. And I went all in. And right before the earnings, a lot of people were shorting it. And I was like, ooh. And the stock, it was the greatest run up, I believe, in history. One day run up in terms of, and it's now a $1 trillion company. Of course, by the time this out now, it's probably half. But my point being, in big ways or small ways, being early and right is awe-inspiring and is the greatest joy I experience.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. You talk about it in the book very briefly. One of the people who came on the show was Joe Pine, who talks about the experience economy. And I called him a futurist on the show. He says, I'm not a futurist. He says, I look at the present and I discern patterns in the present.
By the way, I love that. My partner Gary says, you want to see the future, look at the current.
That was the quote. That's the quote in the book. That's exactly what I was thinking of when you said that.
Well, doesn't it make sense? Like, think for a second. Other than the word God is the only thing I could think of which causes itself, because we don't know what precedes God. So therefore, it's a spontaneous cause. It has no precedent. Everything else in life has a precedent, right? So it makes sense that the future is dictated by what you see right now. People, for some reason, think that there's like soothsayers. No soothsayers. It's just people who are assessing the present.
Yeah, you assess the present, but I can see that being able to perceive the emergent of the present is looking at God. Seeing in that direction, right? I can totally see that.
Well, because what is God is some pre-wiring of a pattern, right? Playing out. Everything's wired, right? I mean, why it makes me feel close to God.
So let's talk about your teams a little bit, which is, first of all, do you want everybody on your team to be a boat burner? Or maybe at different phases of a company you want them to be?
No, I want everybody to be a boat burner. That doesn't mean that I want them to quit. I want them to bleed for what they care about. And it doesn't even need to be me. And they don't even need to stay with me. I always have very honest, open conversations with people saying, a corporation cannot solve all your ambitions. And that's what creates frustration and cognitive dissonance on both sides. If my trajectory is stuck on a certain path for some reasons, capital constrained, structure, thesis, but you believe you have a different future in mind. When I find when an employee wants the company to satisfy that ambition, that's where things go wrong, right? And so I have very open conversations, but no matter what, I want everybody to be a boat burner.
It reminds me a little bit, one of the things you mentioned was, I can't remember which coach it was who talked about people who finish.
Yeah, Mangini.
What was it that he was talking about there?
Yeah, that actually haunts me sometimes because I'm like, do I finish enough? I'm always hard on myself in this area. He was talking about playing through the whistle in football, like that you just like you're not mindful of the whistle, you're just going all in regardless. It's a version of a burn the boats, I guess, but in a football context, it was about doing every mundane task to its fullest extent and never phoning it in. And I think in the professional context, it's about a commitment to excellence regardless of the payoff, I would say, personal or otherwise. It's just you are painting, you're creating. This is your masterpiece.
That sounds really fun. I mean, that's the experience you want to have. And I've had it at times in my career where everybody around me. I remember one time I was working on a project and it was 6:30 on a Friday and everybody was still there. 8 at night, everybody was still there. And it wasn't by arrangement. It was because everybody around me was in it and we were crushing it, honestly. And it was just, that's where we wanted to be.
Let's pick this apart. Why it might not be easy for an employee maybe to feel that way, right? One could be, well, that's great, but I don't own the company, or I don't have equity, or my boss doesn't value me anyway, right? I actually think there's a way to burn the boats no matter what your situation is because you're living an intentional life. There's a way for you to personally extract value from the exercise, no matter what potentially hard condition you're in, right? Like excellence will always inure to your benefit, even if not in the ways you're defining it. Well, it won't inure to my benefit because I don't own the company. Yes, but you will now have a track record of excellence. You will now know how to replicate excellence in an environment where you do own the company. You know what I mean? You will now be able to leverage that because now you have more power, because now the company's more dependent upon you because you are excellent. So I think this idea of quiet quitting is like such fool's gold, to be honest. There's always a way to extract value from excellence.
In addition to all that, this is your life.
Right. It'll corrupt your soul eventually. You will lose your self-respect if you are not pursuing excellence.
Yeah.
Because you always get to vote with your feet, right? So if you're really saying, I cannot perform here, I cannot give it my all because I hate everything about it, or I work for a tyrant, I respect and understand that and value that. But then you must be willing to vote with your feet. You must quit. You know what I mean? Not quiet quit, loudly quit. I have loudly quit multiple times when I have not gotten, I talk about in the book. I worked for Giuliani version 1.0 before the latest incarnation. But back then, when he was America's mayor, but I quit twice because I was doing all this work behind the scenes, writing speeches. Granted, I was like 12 years old, but I was like, you know what? I want the recognition. And they were like, wait your turn. I'm like, I have a better idea. How about I quit? And then 4 months later, they gave me the job and the promotion.
I want to talk about the second time you quit, because to me, that was the hard one. Because not only did you quit something where you were already at a very high level. So in other words, you had a lot of, I don't know if it's sunk value, I don't know what to call that exactly, but you've established something that you can build on. You're already pretty high up and you went into something completely different. How did that happen?
That's a great line. I'm going to try to be very honest so we don't put like a veneer on this. I was deputy press secretary at that point. I was 24 years old, I think. It was in the dot-com era. There's a lot of acrimony when you work in politics. It just like begins to like, I don't know, poison you a bit. And the dot-com era was so excited. It triggered my entrepreneurial drive, which I hadn't connected with. There was a company called Cosmo.com, Kozmo, delivered everything to you in an hour. This is 1998. And we were in the middle of this incredible boom. And I was watching people get equity stakes that were turning into millions of dollars. My mother was still taking care of her, and I was making a decent salary, but not enough to take care of her, frankly. I was giving her sponge baths. So it was like, I see an even faster path to achieve wealth, and it appeals to something in me. I was starting to learn about me more and more that I'm addicted to creation in a somewhat chaotic environment and ambiguity. But I don't only need to do it in a political context where it can sometimes feel rotten. I could do it in a business context. So I went to this crazy startup. So It was a harder stitch to your point because I now had more trappings, right? I had more money, more whatever. But the motivation,
You're burning a bigger boat.
I love it. We can get into that in a second. Let's defer, but I like talking about this topic because it's very nuanced too. But that was a harder decision. Plus, the mayor at the time was very adamant. I was never coming back. You don't get to do that twice. And I didn't care if I was ever coming back, frankly. I thought the time it would take for me to be press secretary, which is the ultimate prize, wouldn't happen under that horizon. We only had 2.5 years left, and I didn't think I would get that job because I was so young. So I figured, whatever, this is a step change. Of course, they gave me the job anyway. By the way, this is hard advice for me to give to young people because I do believe this. You do always have to be willing to quit if you want to achieve exponential growth. There's like the CEO of Microsoft, I think, started there like 25, whatever. There are those stories, but they're rare. I think familiarity does breed contempt. It's just the truth. We all do it. And if you want to achieve step changes, you must at least consider radical change, which is quitting. And I found a lot of people want the comfort and predictability of a job, but want all their career ambitions to be satisfied by the same place. And it's just not always realistic.
Yeah.
Not that I want to encourage all your listeners to quit. I just think that it's got to be on the table.
Well, no. I mean, if you draw a circle around a large organization, there are finite resources within the walls of that organization. You're competing with others in that space for those finite resources. If you can break one of those walls and go out in the direction of something where there is not competition, or at least, it's new, there's a world of opportunity. It's like I think of the people who found Hawaii. They set out in boats into the ocean with not knowing what they were going to find, and they found a whole new island that they could inhabit. It's like that.
And I also think if you deconstruct what is at the essence a job and the act of hiring somebody, it's an attempt to solve a unsolved problem at the moment in time, working towards a goal. And there's just a bias to think the new thing is the thing they haven't considered or the thing that's going to solve it. And people are willing to pay more for that new thing often than an organization that already knows everything about somebody. It's unfortunate and unfair and wrong, but it's the reality. And sometimes you have to use it to your advantage.
Yeah. This actually follows on from wanting boat burners on your team. Do you see wisdom in Elon Musk's approach to Twitter?
I do, and I don't. The part that I do is he lowers the bar to experimentation to the point that it's like barely off the floor. And I think that can unleash a ton of magic. I think he just doesn't care about being judged for very public failures and enables him to iterate at lightning speed. He challenges every conventional thought, almost like he's a child playing, like just pissing you off. And I think that winners iterate. So when I see iteration that's not frantic and completely ad hoc, but it's faster than the normal cadence, that works out in ways that we just can't imagine. So I've been very public saying he's going to figure it out. And I've been bashed a lot for that. Like he's going to figure it out. Now I could separate my ultimate judgment that he will figure Twitter out from, I think it's unfortunate that he seems to have fallen for the drug, the dopamine hit of likes and followers. He seems to have been consumed by his own platform and has gone completely partisan. And I think that's unfortunate because he's the richest person in the world. He's the Thomas Edison of our time. And so what he chooses to do with that platform has a pretty significant impact on people's lives. I wish instead of talking about Dogecoin, he was talking about subjugation, human rights. He's just got so much power in his hands. I think there'll be a maturation of Elon Musk that we'll witness. I actually think he's a libertarian and he's not a Republican or a Democrat. He's just kind of pissing everybody off, but he obviously leans a little more conservative. I think, unfortunately, because he's playing to some extent, he's a bit careless with people feelings. And I'm hoping he's only 50, right? Or whatever. Hoping there's a maturation, but I have no doubt he's going to figure out Twitter. I've said this before, like what's harder, Twitter or launching someone to outer space or making electric cars mainstream? Like, come on. It's a platform. I think the part that he underestimated, that I probably underestimated, was sort of the momentary backlash on advertising. But like once he turns Twitter into a financial platform, allowing transactions, and maybe he'll embrace, sign in with ETH or one of the other crypto tools that enable authentication, whatever. When he morphs it into a true financial real-time trading platform, it is the home of crypto, is Twitter, right? He'll stumble upon how to monetize it. And the advertisers are hilarious. Like they're like reeds in the wind, they'll come back in droves. And so, but at the moment it looks harder than those other things because it's very public. All Twitter does is monetize impressions, right? At the end of the day, for a profit. He's already made it a break-even platform and it hasn't fallen apart. Still operates, still there every morning.
How does burning the boats relate to the law? And the reason I bring that up is that there are an awful lot of very successful people who seem to get indicted. And oftentimes it's around taxes or something like that. But when you decide to go all out and you decide to doubt the constraints, there seems to be the risk that one of those constraints is the law.
That's a great question. I don't think they're at all incompatible because, again, breaking it down, burning the boat speaks to total and utter commitment to achieve the goal. But you get to define the parameters which you're willing to cross. If you're saying one tactic that is not available to me is breaking the law because I don't feel like being Elizabeth Holmes' roommate, like that's your parameter, your boundary. We all need boundaries, right? Or else we're completely unregulated. We won't be successful. So, but burn the boats is like, I'm going to continue to iterate through my tactics until I figure out the winning one that's going to achieve my objective. But I have my own, for example, my boats that I won't burn, because again, using it as a metaphor, that which holds us back is my custody schedule of my children. Like if my epitaph says that like, here lies the richest man in the world, but he had a bad relationship with his kids, I failed. So I have defined my boundaries. My wife is my best friend. I will not undertake anything that doesn't enable me to spend a lot of time with her, right? So we need boundaries, and I would argue the law should probably be one. I think it's less about burn the boats and more about narcissistic personalities who believe the rules don't apply to them. You know what I mean? Or maybe slightly sociopathic personalities, but definitely narcissistic. And then eventually they get their comeuppance. And I don't think you have to be a narcissist to burn the boats by any stretch.
Here's another one. Are you, like me, a bit ADD, which is to say, if something's not fascinating, it's hard to pay attention to, and fear makes things fascinating?
I'm not a bit ADD. I'm a lot ADD. So I would say that. But if I look we all have different traits and qualities that are vying and sometimes in opposition to each other. So I actually don't think ADD is the dominant quality. Above it is introverted. And I am very introverted. I am very empathetic. Those two are the reason why I am introverted, because I only want to be around a degree of suffering or have authentic conversations, but then they weigh on me. And then I need a lot of time to think. So sometimes I think my need to be alone can manifest as ADD. I'm hopscotching, but actually it's because I'm sitting in the stream of data sets so I can extract insights. So that's exciting to me, right? I counterbalance my ADD with advice that my partner gives me, which is don't be a grasshopper. Don't jump. So you're allowed to scale beyond that which you did before. So this may seem like I'm contradicting, but it should be intentional, right? Like, okay, I'm done with that. Hey, everyone, I'm now done. I'm going to move on orderly, but I finished what I started. And so I do have a degree of ADD. I need the stimulation, but I counterbalance it with making sure I respect myself. And I would not respect myself if my world is littered with empty promises that weren't fulfilled or propaganda. You know what I mean? Like even the book, frankly, I always say this. I wrote the book so I would read the book. I asterisk the hell out of my life. And same with my advice in the book. I think these sort of self-styled gurus, a lot of them who haven't done anything in their life, purporting to have the answers, are actually perpetuating a degree of violence upon the viewer because they are projecting this idea. Here's my narrative. I stumbled. I was redeemed. I'm now okay. Let me pass on my wisdom. My narrative is I stumbled, was born into dirt, figured out some answers. I actually couldn't follow my own advice. I tried again. I progress and I regress. That is the human condition. And so I always say that my book is my attempt to also hold myself accountable. So when my range of thought strays, what did I write in the book? Let's make sure that I'm sticking with my core principles, which is, by the way, anyone out there who wants to write a book, one of the best part is it's the ultimate accountability partner. You know what I mean? Like, you can't run from those words. And people will meet me, high-level people, CEOs. I mean, if you look at the back of the book, people who've endorsed it have been amazing. They're like, but wait, in the book you said this. I'm like, oh, okay, crap. Is that consistent? And then I have to go through this jujitsu.
Right. And actually, let me read one of those blurbs, which I thought was really great. It was Arnold Schwarzenegger. I hate Plan B. I almost want to say it like him, right?
Yeah, do say like that. I hate Plan B.
I hate Plan B. It sounds, because when you read it, you hear Arnold Schwarzenegger in your head.
You hear it, right? Because it's so decisive.
I know. I hate plan B. I always tell people that to achieve big dreams, you have to ignore the naysayers, but the naysayers are external. Once you have a plan B, you've become your own naysayer. He's a great example, I think, of somebody who just goes for it. I mean, he's always...
Well, you know what's fun about the blurbs, anybody listening? Some of the blurbs on the back of the book were my own game. Because I was thinking, with this book, I'm not just writing a book, I'm engineering an outcome, right? I always approach it that way. I'm not writing a book, I'm engineering an outcome. What's the outcome I want? I want to talk to somebody who feels marginalized, who feels self-selected out of ambition because they have anxiety. And I want to let them know that you can do it too. But I know that first you're going to see me as the white guy on Shark Tank and think I'm rich or whatever. I need to pull back the curtain for you to believe you can see yourself in me. And then in terms of selling the book, I was like, I told the publisher, these are the blurbs I'm going to get. And the response was great. Well, that's lovely, Matthew. I'm sure you'll get Arnold Schwarzenegger, David Solomon, president of Goldman Sachs, Bobby Brown, Jay Shetty, Mark Cuban. Every single person gave me a blurb. And I worked on it for 4 months of my life, including Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's not like I know Arnold. And so people would have said, that's why bother. That's the other point about pursuit of excellence. What does it matter? Blurbs don't matter. Like maybe they don't, but maybe they do.
Did you pick people who you saw as examples?
I did. All those people are in there because in one way or another, they exemplify what I talk about in the book. But secondly, to be honest with you, they're a cross-section. I think when you look at blurbs, you can see the connective tissue of the people in it to the author's life. You know what I mean? Like you operate within one vertical. Like Adam Grant's book, you might have Good to Great, Built to Last, like all those different authors, right? Who are Brene Brown. Like I wanted a cross-section of different people that we all admire and sought them out.
What'd you learn writing the book?
God, such a good question. I can talk about what I learned about book writing first, book publishing.
Yeah.
I learned that every book is born an orphan, and the author doesn't realize that. You think that the act of writing a book is writing the book, whereas the act of writing book is actually selling the book. And selling the book will affect your self-esteem. It'll affect your endurance. It'll make you feel dejected and alone because you think that there's this infrastructure that will rise up around you and carry your book. And it's so good and it'll sell itself. Or the publisher who gave you the check will work at overtime and none of that is true. And so it's like the disconnect between the amount of time it takes to write a book and the amount of effort that goes into selling the book is incredible. And the lack of preparation you have for the act of selling it, the extent to which most people are ill-equipped to actually sell it. Like it is stunning. And fortunately I was kind of prepared, but even to the extent to which I was prepared, I'm like, oh, nobody really cares. And then you take a step back. I had a moment of complete panic, but then reverence. Once I always go to Barnes & Noble and I sit on the floor. People are like, here he is again. I just sit. I love being in an environment. And one time I was looking at the books soon before this was published and looking at all the new releases and be like, each one of these people thinks this is the best book out there. And each one thinks that it will take a life of its own. And who am I to think that my book deserves to be ahead of those people? And so it was one nerve-wracking because I'm like, oh, wait, we all feel this way too. Very humbling. And I realized that for the book to be true, I need to burn the boats for burn the boats. And so my whole orientation has now become about that. So that was one thing I learned from it. Two, on the flip side, the books have more authority than any other form of communication. And because they're a book, and the reader who bothers with it is both making a 7-hour investment into it, but two, the books have this imbued authority because it's a mystery. How'd you write a book? Oh my God, it must take years. If you do it well, your message will stick in a way that an Instagram post won't, and a TV show won't, and a documentary won't. And that is amazing because, like I said, I wake up every day to at least one person somewhere in the world who connects with me, sees me, and has made radical change that they were cradling, but didn't have the confidence to do. And my book enabled them to do it in a way that a podcast would not. All these themes I cover in my podcast, they would last like an hour, but they wouldn't go. But a book weirdly lasts forever. And that's amazing.
That's true. The thing about taking a book out into the publishing world, the thing to remember about the publishing world is that their business sucks. It's all upfront risk for them if they extend you money in advance. And then they have to front money to the printer. And the printer's going to ask for that money back in 90 days. And if they don't sell enough of your book in 90 days to actually pay the printer back, that comes out of their pocket. And your average nonfiction books makes $10,000. So it's all risk. It's not a lot of return. And you are a much better play for them than your average writer. You have name recognition, people who know you are, you've got success.
I agree with all that. And every author has an awakening that, oh, wait, you're really just a bank. You're kind of advancing. And the reality is, we'll see, to deconstruct this a bit, in any environment I'm in, usually when I bring my intensity and I'm modeling like what sacrifice looks like, and I go above and beyond. I always say, what's the one thing a rational person would not do in this situation? I'm going to do that thing. Now, normally the boat burners will come along and be like, all right, let's go. That doesn't happen in the publishing industry because somebody figured out a long time ago through some actuarial data, whatever the equivalent is in this context, that no amount of incremental effort really changes the trajectory of a book on their part. And so you can't inspire the whole system to rise up with you because they've already concluded their incremental effort won't make a difference. But when the publishers are all vying for your book, they don't tell you that, just so you know, by the way, we're not really going to devote a lot to this. And by the way, it wouldn't be rational for us to do so, which I respect. Here's the challenge. The dollar amount, let's say it's $30, is being carved up by too many parties so that there's not enough incremental money left, or residual money left rather, for anyone to spend against acquisition. So the book only costs $30. If everybody's left, the author gets $4, the publisher is getting $8, right? Nobody has enough revenue to justify customer acquisition. And so I think as an author, you're like, wow, I can't use digital spend because it costs too much to acquire a customer. Like, not everybody can get on the Today Show. What it's made me realize is, this sounds stupid and obvious, but there's so many books out there in the world that languished and never got a chance for an audience that are probably magnificent because the system isn't designed for it to rise up.
Yeah.
I do think we're going to be in a world where the self-publishing becomes more and more of the standard because it would leave more of the revenue in the hands of the author to spend efficiently for acquisition. And I think what prevents that at the moment is the New York Times list, because you wouldn't get on it if you weren't with a major publisher. But I think that's fading and brand equity by the day.
What did you learn about the topic writing the book?
I learned that it was more true than I ever imagined. I did not realize that every culture has a story. I discover new ones all the time. I didn't know about the authority of it. So I knew it would provoke. I probably didn't know how hard it would be to explain how you balance risk synthesis with being all in. And I made a choice to write a book that was about storytelling because I think that's how we assimilate information. I think lazy business books try to write them like reference books, and they're prescriptive and pedantic. I made a choice to make this engaging, interesting, compelling.
Which it is.
Thank you. But as a result, I compromised a little bit of the prescriptive. And what I've decided recently is, why can't I just let the book live forever? Like, I'm going to write another chapter now that shores up some of the risk issue. Like, I'm just going to keep writing the book, and then I'll just keep releasing chapters. Because that's what bothers me. I want it to be, I'll talk to somebody and they'll find a hole in it. I'm like, ooh, that's actually a good point. I should have addressed that more. That causes anxiety until I realize I don't have to write new books. I could just keep writing this book and I'll just add more chapters. You know what I mean? Who says I can't write more chapters forever? Everyone's like, what about, you'll have another book? I'm like, well, I don't want to address it in another book. I want to address it in this book.
It's another thing. If you'd waited long enough to find all those holes and fill them, you wouldn't have a book right now.
I agree, which is funny. I'm very hard on myself. A lot of times I will write things and then work on it and then I'll start all over again. And this time, considering that I actually had to put it to bed, there aren't that many things that I feel that way about. And the things I do feel are usually a byproduct of the choice I made to make it a more storytelling and compelling. I do like this epiphany I had of saying, I could just add chapters and create a community.
Right. That's what A, add chapters, and B, incorporate them into the second run.
Right. And the third run, we're on the fifth run now already. It's pretty amazing. The fifth run, it's only been 3 months. So just keep adding stuff. But by the way, that's the other thing, to publisher, when I want to change things. I'm like, whatever. Who cares? It's a living document.
Right. Then they become collector's items. And you can actually have like a whole collector's, this is version 1, version 2, sign them.
I do wonder, I think the jury's out. One thing I learned, I love the idea of building a brand around this commitment. The burn the boats phrase is ownable and has not been owned. But like you said, something so great at the beginning of this interview, which is something I've been thinking about, like, oh, it's uncomfortable. I don't want to. I don't think the title of the book sells itself, especially given the payoff in the book. And so I wonder in the end, will that have been the wrong choice? I won't regret it because it was intentional, but I do wonder if I've made it harder for the book to sell.
No, I really don't believe it.
You don't think so?
No, 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 no. Two reasons. One is it has a handle that now people will be able to use that handle to refer to the whole book. I see this with friends that I talk to on a routine basis is we develop these handles to talk about giant subjects. And so now it has this handle where somebody can say, well, it's a burn the boat situation. And what that carries with it is that's just the handle for everything that's in the book. Now, the problem is, of course, it gets simplified and people forget all the detail in the book sometimes, and it ends up not meaning what you meant. But B, a little while ago, I was driving through the parking lot at the Stanford Shopping Center in Palo Alto, and there was a miles per hour sign, a speed limit sign, and it was 19 miles per hour. And I paid attention to it because it's the first time I've seen a sign that said 19 miles per hour.
By the way, I would obsess if I saw that 19-mile-an-hour sign. That's amazing. What a good idea.
And in retrospect, I think I probably should have looked around because probably the Stanford Decision Labs was there someplace saying, did he slow down? But nobody's not going to notice that title. They're going to notice it. And they're going to say, I want to be in a fight with that title. Or they say, yeah, prove to me I want to, so I think it's way better.
I love that you're saying this because let's talk if I'm right. That was my epiphany, was like, wow, this is a way to own something that also provokes at least 30% of the population and it engages you. But on the flip side, I think in order for you to know that you should want to read it, you have to have heard about from somebody else that I should want to read this and what's in it. And I think that's a heavier bar. But I like hearing you say it because that was my original thesis. But then some days I wonder, oof, this really has, I have to really represent this book, this thesis, in order for it to break through. If anybody could do it, I can. I know how to do it. I'm out there. But boy, I'm like, some days I'm like, can't it just sell itself? Do I have to do this work?
Yeah. You're second guessing a burn the boat like moment decision.
Yep. I like to model it too, because I get back to my original point. I think it's an authentic not to. Just because you know the answers doesn't mean you could always implement them. And we need to talk about that honestly. We all need that. It's all part of the process.
Right.
It doesn't mean that today I won't go on CNBC at 7 p.m., which I will. It just means that I'm open-minded to getting things wrong too. I'm intellectually curious.
That's the really right way to put a book into the world, which is let's listen to the echo and see what we learn from it. So I ask everybody at the end of every episode an odd question, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
Okay, give me more.
Okay. Your job hires you to do something for it. If I buy a shovel, the job I want it to do for me is to dig a hole. That's what I want from it. You've kind of already answered this, which is I want my job to get me close to God, to that feeling. But I will tell you that when I look at things you do, like for instance, working for Autism Speaks, that's work that you do that is for something. So what job do you hire your job to do for you? Like, what are you getting from your job?
I think in some ways I am like a fly or an insect stuck in amber that we discover, thousands of years later. Like I'm stuck as a 16-year-old boy who watched the dislocation or the disequilibrium between being born in a certain circumstance and having all this potential, but not having the means to unlock it. Watching my mother, who had a crazy high IQ, but ultimately died from obesity and the product of a life of abuse. Like, I'm stuck in that moment because I'm constantly trying to correct the imbalance in different situations. And so I see a CEO who, if only they would face their own issues, they'd stop being a martyr, they could achieve as exponential success. So I would say I'm constantly unlocking people and situations. The book talks about the bartender from Ireland, Aidan. It's my favorite story in the book in chapter 8, who went from a complete zero with the company because he couldn't deal with his inner demons. And I brought an industrial psychologist, and he created a culture of radical transparency. And 19 months later, sold the business for $150 million. So I guess, I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, but my job is a canvas for me to constantly unlock and right the wrongs. I mean, again, if I was sitting on a therapist couch, I'd probably be like, I think you're stuck in this like hero complex to save mom, whatever. when I see disequilibrium and I see the barista at Starbucks who should own the store instead, for me, that's a delightful opportunity to right the imbalance. I think I might be meting out justice on behalf of that sad little apartment in Queens.
I've asked this question hundreds and hundreds of times, and I've never gotten that answer. And it's really fascinating. It's like being a catalyst, which is there's this imbalance, and with just a tweak.
That's how I love that you say that. I would say to my wife, if I could just twist the helix and the DNA strands just a little bit.
Just a tiny bit.
Yeah, and I want to be honest about the psychological derivation of it, because one could say, well, that's derivative. Okay, fine, maybe, but we're all a product of what we've been through. But also, that feels like the exponential return on effort is amazing. If you could change the trajectory in somebody's life. I went on a podcast of young people, and I talked about, there was a woman who was a host, and her audience is like 18 to 23. And she was saying all the themes that are in the book really resonate with her audience because they think about imposter syndrome and anxiety. And I was like, really? I was like, look, if anyone's out there and they can't afford it and they have a problem, direct message me. I get these DMs from these young people who are like, I haven't been able to get out of bed because of my anxiety, but I know I have more in me. And it sounds like I need your book. And I was saying to my wife, imagine like the return on investment of $30 to send them the book plus $10 shipping. If I could change that person and get them out of bed today, that's crazy. So I think my job gives me an opportunity writ large to do that in different contexts.
Yeah, the analogy that comes to mind for me is that there's all this pent up water. And if you can just like knock down that dam right there, sometimes it's markets. Like I see a market out there. That's very compelling. I think that's a very compelling vision for work.
Yeah. And that was my point about being close to God or the universe. Like that's amazing. That's like, it was right there to happen. And we bought Magnolia Bakery recently during the pandemic. And I had to really debate whether we should buy it when no one of those stores could open. Anyway, we bought it. And the same thing, it was like frozen in time from Sex and the City episode. It had not evolved. And it was so obvious to us. And fast forward, we just launched cookies, Magnolia banana pudding cookies all over the country. Like, again, that's not a spiritual, but it's the same concept, right? It's a little unlock. And I love identifying them. And the point is, back to the part of the journey about burn the boats, they all begin with this act of total commitment to the goal. And they all begin alone, because back to the magnitude of the opportunity as an inverse relationship with the evidence, I had to act like I had to overlook the pandemic to buy Magnolia. Well, pandemics end, presumably. Everyone did, unless we're all going to die. And we didn't. So
what does your job cost you or your work?
That's a great question. What it really cost me is peace, because the act of unlocking is arduous and it's full of doubt and speculation. And because I'm always context shifting and I'm not like a victory lap taker or a storyteller necessarily in terms of self-aggrandizement, my energy is always focused at that which isn't working and that which where I'm failing. And also questioning whether I'm being grandiose or delusional or a corrupt data set. So it cost me the peace, and it cost me the clarity of problem victory, right? Celebration, because I'm context shifting all the time. So if I'm being honest, I pay a heavy price in quality of life.
Yeah. Where can people learn more about you and about your book?
Okay. Well, here's Burn the Boats. Here's the book. It's on Amazon at Barnes & Noble. I tend to spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, Matt Higgins, and also Instagram. There's also a website, which I'm having so much fun building. It's called burntheboatsbook.com. It has become the repository for the research. So if you think the book is bullshit, you can then go there and then pick it apart. I'm also launching AI chatbot of every interview I've ever done around the book, studies from the book. So if you feel alone after you read it, you can ask any question and it'll be me. We've created our own closed data set. I think I'm the first author to do that with their book, but that'll be, by the time this airs, that should be launched on burntheboatsbook.com.
Great. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was awesome.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.